already. So the Joe Danes were recalled and destroyed except for 3. And this is the only one in the world that is running. It's proudly owned by the Northern Illinois Steam Power Club.
Of the other 2 that were remaining, one of them is currently being worked on and restored, and the other one was actually bought by John Deere. And they have it, but it's just a museum piece for the most part. This is one of the only examples you'll see really running around and doing any kind of work.
In 1956, a group of local farmers in the DeKalb area got together and watched a film produced by the J.I. Cage Company of Racine, Wisconsin, called When Steam Was King, which recounted the days of the steam threshermen and early power on the American farm. After watching the video, they began to discuss amongst themselves how interesting it would be to get an old steam engine out of a barn, get an old threshing machine behind it, and do some threshing the way they did back in the olden days. The first engine to do that is this one coming up the lane right now. This is a 20 horsepower Minneapolis, and it has never missed a reunion for as long as we've been here as the Northern Illinois Steam Power Club. The Minneapolis company was out of Hopkins, Minnesota, and is notable for a number of reasons. In their later years, they offered 3 sizes of engines, a 20, 24, and 28 horsepower model. This is a 20 horse. Of note is the matching Minneapolis threshing machine being towed behind it. Oftentimes, this equipment would be shipped in pairs from the factory on a flat car and unloaded close to its destination, steamed up at the railroad station, and driven to the farm. The Minneapolis company was located in Hopkins, Minnesota, right next to an art college. There are several Minneapolis engines here on the ground, and you'll notice that none of them are painted the same. That is because the Minneapolis company would hire art students from the adjacent college to paint and pinstripe their engines, so no 2 Minneapolises appear the same cosmetically. Again, this is owned by the Peterson family out of Hampshire, Illinois. What do those whistles sound like? Of another. It's very unusual to see a brick in this part of the country since they were produced out east. This is one of only 2 double-cylinder engines on the ground, meaning that unlike most of the engines that have 1 cylinder, these have 2. It uses the steam only once in either cylinder before it's exhausted out of the stack. Owned by the Peterson family of Hampshire, Illinois, it is pulling a water tender. Out in the field when resources were limited, you'd have to carry extra water and fuel with you, and that's what this home-built wagon is for. What do those whistles sound like? This blue engine here is a Baker traction engine built by the Baker Company of Swanton, Ohio. It is owned by the Peterson family. It was built in 1925. It is a 21 and 75 horsepower model. Notice that I gave 2 horsepower readings. These engines were rated in 2 different ways. How much you could pull on your drawbar, which is the 21 horse, or how much you could pull with the belt pulley, the big flywheel on your side by the bleachers. That is the 75 horse. This machine is another very special machine to have here in Sycamore. It is the only remaining 22 horsepower traction engine built by the Illinois Thresher Company of Sycamore, Illinois. If any of you are local, you'll know where the Bloom & Gardens plant is. That is the remains of the factory where these machines were produced. They offered 3 sizes of engines, a 20, 22, and 25 horse. There is this 22, 2 20s, and 3 25s. Operated by the Stevens and Bacon family today with Dave and Ben up there. What's the whistle sound like, Dave? and restored by the Northern Illinois Steam Power Club. Thanks for bringing it through. Okay. Next in line is the first Ford Huron that you guys will see this year. Jack, I'm going to have you pull it up a little bit here, and then we're going to stop you for a second. We asked Jack to bring this engine through backwards so you guys can see the engine side of one of these machines. Notice that you have a small cylinder here and a larger cylinder there. There are two pistons inside this engine that power the same crank. That's known as a tandem compound. Compounding is what happens when you use steam more than once in the same work. So, physics tells us that a small diameter and a high pressure is equal in pushing force to a large diameter and a low pressure. Steam leaves the boiler, enters the small cylinder, does its work at a high pressure, and it's already lost some of its heat efficiency, is then exhausted at a lower pressure and a lower temperature into the big cylinder, pushes the piston back the opposite way, so you get twice as much work and efficiency out of the same batch of steam. As I said, this is a 19 horsepower Ford Huron owned by the Rumely family of Maple Park, Illinois. It is known as a Longfellow engine because of the abnormally long boiler barrel, being operated by Jack Stuffle today. What's that whistle sound like, Jack? All right, thank you. Next in line is our first case. During the age of steam, the J.I. Case Company of Racine, Wisconsin was the most prolific manufacturer of traction engines in the United States. And this is their mid-size model. This is a 50-horse case owned by the Druin family. We've got Austin up there at the throttle today. What happened to your headlight, Austin? I'll have to ask you about it later. There's a small steam engine underneath the operator's seat that actually steers the machine. If that engine wasn't there, the big red handle on your side right below the operator is how you would steer it. And I can speak personally when I say that's a lot of work. It's a good thing that engine's on there to help you steer. The fireman has to walk alongside this machine. There's nowhere for him to sit. What's that whistle sound like? All right, thanks for bringing it through. Here is another engine produced by the J.I. Case Company out of Racine, Wisconsin. This is a 65 horsepower model. As I said, the Case Company was the most prolific manufacturer of traction engines during the age of steam, and this size of engine, a 65 horse, was the most common engine and their most popular model. It's owned by the Fruit family out of Kirkland, Illinois. We've got Charlie and his family up there today. What's that slide whistle sound like, guys? All right, thank you. You've seen a 50 case. You just saw a 65 horsepower case. This is a 40 horsepower case. This machine is owned by the Hubbard family out of Shawnee, Illinois, being operated by Kevin Palczynski today up there at the throttle. Depending on the size of your engine, you can do a number of tasks with it. A smaller engine like this was better suited to belt work off of the pulley than it was for drawbar work, but it could pull the plow just as easily as it could thrash or saw lumber. What's that little howl whistle sound like? All right, thanks for bringing it through, Kevin. our second 19 horsepower Ford Huron. As I explained the horsepower ratings before, this is a 19 and 65 horsepower model, meaning 19 horsepower on the drawbar and 65 horsepower on the belt pulley. It is a tandem compound, just like the one you saw earlier. Another notable feature of Ford Huron engines are the cast rear wheels. The unique fleet pattern was a marketing material in their catalogs. They claimed these wheels were self-cleaning. They would never be full of mud. Whether or not that's true, I do not know. But it was a sales gimmick, and one of the things Ford Huron is known for. This engine is owned by Neil Drummer out of Lemoyle, Illinois. What's that whistle sound like? All right, thanks for bringing it through. Here is the other double-cylinder traction engine here on the ground. This is a Connery traction engine. It's a 22 horsepower, built in 1924 in Mount Vernon, Indiana. This one recently went through a cosmetic restoration and now appears very similar to how it did fresh from the factory in 1924. Owned by the Staley family out of Portland, Illinois. What's that whistle sound like, you guys? All right. Oftentimes, in industry, back in the age of steam, you'd have small boilers and stationary engines for doing a number of things, whether it be powering a machine shop or a small mill of some sort. But during the preservation era now, there's nothing really to do with those machines. So what do? You get a truck chassis, a stationary steam engine, and a small vertical boiler, and you make one of these, a home-built, steam-powered Doodlebug. You'll find a lot of these around the country at various steam shows, some of which are even street legal and can reach speeds of up to 40 or 50 miles an hour. This machine is owned and constructed by Bob Yelm of Lombard, Illinois. Any whistles on there? All right, thanks for bringing it through. I said before that the J.I. Case Company was the most prolific manufacturer of traction engines. The Advanced Rumely Company of LaPorte, Indiana, was probably the second most prolific manufacturer. This is an Advanced Rumely. It is an 18 horsepower, and no, 20 horse, 18 horse, that's what I thought. Owned by the Walsh family out of Pell Lake, Wisconsin. We've got John up there at the throttle and his family in tow today. This is another long-time engine here at the showgrounds. John does a lot of work for us as far as the steam engines and everything in the club goes. What's that little whistle sound like, John? This is a 24 horsepower Minneapolis. This engine was constructed in 1918 and is owned by the Luton's family out of West Chicago, Illinois. Look closely. That's a brand new boiler on this engine. It looks like it's 100 years old, but it is completely modern construction. This engine spent its working life doing a lot of road work in and out of limestone quarries in the Chicago area.
If your name is Barbara and you lost a wallet, please make your way to the information booth that is being held there. It'll look like your ID picture.
Up next is another product of the Minneapolis Threshing Machine Company out of Hopkins, Minnesota. This is another 20 horsepower engine. One characteristic of Minneapolis engines is the big front water tank. This is called a head tank, and it's for extra water capacity. As I mentioned before, if you're in the middle of the field, these machines don't move very fast, and they use a lot of water. If you don't have water, you don't have steam, and then you don't have power. So you carry a lot of extra water and fuel with that head tank to keep you running for longer out in the field. This machine is unique in the fact that it has a spark arrestor on the stack. If you're out in the field with a wooden threshing machine, the last thing you want to have happen is have a spark escape from the engine and catch your field and your expensive threshing machinery on fire. So, to get around that, you have a mesh screen on top of the stack designed to capture sparks as they are emitted at high speed from the engine. This machine was constructed in 1922 and is proudly owned and maintained by the Hendrickson family of Edgerton, Wisconsin. The Hendricksons are heavily involved with the Rock River Threshery out of Edgerton, Wisconsin, our sister show. And that show is coming up Labor Day weekend. If you like what you see here today, be sure to check out the Rock River Threshery. Now, Clayton, what does that whistle sound like? Okay, thanks for bringing her through. This is the last Fort Huron you'll see today, another 19 and 65 horsepower model, owned by the Gould family out of Naperville, Illinois. Fresh from the factory, there were several options you had on these machines, one of which was the canopy. If your engine wasn't going to be stored inside, you had an option to have a canopy above your machinery to keep everything protected from the elements. But that costs extra, so some engines you'll see with those and others you will not.
And now from the steam into the gas tractor. Starting out with the John Deere 50, it is a 1953, owned by Gary Pitts out of Chicago, Illinois. Here we got a beautiful McCormick Farmall H, owned by Bill Eschbach out of Marengo. Absolutely, and with a great little tool back here. This is a Vermeer Model 12 to 1952. If you ever had to lay pipes or wires or anything and had to dig trenches for it, this would be a useful tool for you. And here we've got a 1954 Farmall Super MPA diesel, owned by Dan Wells out of DeKalb, Illinois. Local boy, beautiful tractor, thank you. Here's a 1950 John Deere B 47 late style. This is owned by Adele Swanson out of Sycamore, Illinois. It's called late styles because some of the A's and B's originally did not have a lot of styling to them. They were just a basic tractor. But eventually John Deere decided that people want their tractors to look nice too. This is a beautiful Alice Chalmers D21. It's a 1968. Owned by Dwight out of Maple Park, Illinois. All the little nozzles on the back, all of that is for hydraulics, which you'd be able to use to power anything, any tools that you were using to hook up to that. Here's a very popular tractor for John Deere. This is a 1967 John Deere 3020 owned by Bill Juns out of Hampshire, Illinois. Eventually, after Case was done making steam engines and they were forced into joining and making gas tractors, they made something like this, the 1929 Case, owned by Julie Mates. And it wasn't until they did originally come out gray like this. They did not use the red color that everybody knows today until much later. This is a baby brother to what we just saw go by before. This is a John Deere 1010. This is a 1962, and it's owned by Tom Ray out of DeKalb, Illinois. This is a 1959 John Deere 730, also owned by Tom Ray out of DeKalb, Illinois. Here comes Rob Ryan on his fantastic Farmall H. The 1943. Was a workhorse, now a show horse. Anytime. Here's a beautiful Farmall F20. This is made in 1939. And it is the Gottschalk family from Byron, Illinois.
What you're seeing here, this is a 30 and 60 horsepower Altman Taylor gasoline traction engine. This is the first step away from steam on the American farm. Notice a lot of similar characteristics between a steam traction engine and this machine here, such as the large flywheel, large driving wheels, etc. This machine is owned by the Green family large gasoline tractor from the transition era away from steam into gasoline and kerosene. This is a Rumely oil pole, and this is actually a tractor, the very first tractor. Before Rumely came up with the terminology tractor, all of these machines were known as traction engines.
This is the 1952 John Deere Model R. This is James Bodie from Sycamore, Illinois, training a new driver. And this is a 1951 John Deere AR, also owned by James Bodie out of Sycamore, Illinois. You can tell it's sort of the little brother to the big R. Very popular pulling tractors here. As you'll see coming up here, this is sort of what we were talking about. With the John Deere at the beginning, they didn't think much about styling. This is the John Deere Jeep, general purpose. It's a Model B, and it was made with very little styling, and it is a bare bones tractor, but this is a beautiful restoration job done on this. It looks like just it came out of the factory. Followed up by another John Deere A, 1937. Again of the GP series. Not a lot of style to it, but a whole lot of function. And eventually this is what John Deere moved on to for their styling with the 1953 John Deere 60, owned by Bob and Dave Brown out of Elgin, Illinois. Here's a 1949 Farmall M, 34 horsepower on it. Owned by Brian Parnell out of Elburn, Illinois. Here's a 1959 John Deere 830. Owned by Nick Rivera out of Carpentersville, Illinois. The John Deere R is ultimately what was the predecessor to this, the 830. This is a very, very unique piece. You will probably not see this tractor anywhere else in the country, maybe not even in the world. This is a Russell Boss, and this tractor was found abandoned out in the field and got a beautiful restoration job done to it. And again, I can honestly say that I've never seen this anywhere else in the world. You guys are getting a treat being able to see this. Here's a 1917 Case Cross Mount 1018, owned by Steve Linker out of Malden, Illinois. Very, very early gas tractor.
This machine here is a Rumely oil pole, another actual tractor from around the transition era from steam to gasoline. It was built in 1928 and is rated at 40 and 60 horsepower, owned by the Linker family of Malden, Illinois. Next in line is a Hyder Model C. This engine is rated at 12 and 20 horsepower, built in 1919 in Rock Island, Illinois, and is owned by Jeff Schott out of Highland Park, Illinois.
Here we've got a 1956 John Deere 70. This is Jim Bodie's out of Sycamore, Illinois, owned with Jason Erickson. Minneapolis Moline, who, as you saw before, made some excellent steam engine tractors, did make normal tractors for a while, gas tractors, once the transition was made over. This is one of them, a 1947 Minneapolis Moline Z. This is owned by Maynard Peterson out of Hampshire, Illinois, being piloted by Kylie Court and friend. Sister, Sophie. Richardson out of Marengo, Illinois, in memory of Grandpa Lloyd Todd. This is a half scale of an Ellis Chalmers WD-45. All of these here owned by the Richardson family out of Marengo. And here this one is based off of a 1950 Farmall W6. A lot of these, as you can probably guess, are based off of lawn tractor chassis. Sometimes those are wheel horse chassis because they're popular for their solid frames.
A 1940 John Deere Beat, owned by Terry Blake out of McHenry, Illinois. 1939 Styles Model A John Deere. This one's owned by Charles Woodridge out of Gilbert, Illinois. Farmall Model M, built in 1945, owned by the Wrangle family out of Kingston, Illinois.
Owned by Monty Rangel. Originally belonged to Butch Mates. This is a Case BAC in 1946, also owned by the Rangel family.
This is a 1928, 25, and 40 horsepower Rumely oil pole, owned by the Hoffmans out of Crystal Lake, Illinois. A smaller version of the large gasoline prairie tractors you saw earlier.
This is a 1944 John Deere A, owned by Kelly Nye out of Marengo, Illinois. McHenry, Illinois. Bought from Dave Snyder's collection. Here's a John Deere